This episode is brought to you by Roundtable Group, the experts on experts. We've been connecting attorneys with experts for over 25 years. Find out more at roundtablegroup.com.
Welcome to Discussions at the Roundtable. I'm your host, Noah Ballmer. Today's guest, Dr. Istvan Jonyer, is the owner of Sidespin Group. He's an inventor, scientist, and entrepreneur that focuses in machine learning, augmented reality, and other emerging technology. Dr. Jonyer holds a Ph.D. from the University of Texas and an MBA from Carnegie Mellon. Dr. Jonyer, thank you so much for joining me here today at the Roundtable.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Let's jump right into it. You have really a fully vertical background in computer science and related technologies, ranging all the way from invention up to funding, and you even have teaching experience. How did you get started, and when did you first get involved in expert witnessing?
Initially, I learned about expert witnessing from a colleague who had a very similar background, someone who was also a PhD in computer science, also did teaching, and also did some investing. And over a coffee conversation, I learned that he was also doing expert witness work on the side. And just based on his description of what was involved, I was very intrigued and immediately looked into it. And within a couple of months, I was on a case.
Oh, no kidding. Has that happened pretty quickly for you? First of all, how long ago was this?
This was at the end of 2018, and I got my first case in, I want to say, February of 2019.
Okay, so you've been doing this a few years. Did your friend have any helpful advice? Did he act as kind of a mentor to get you started, or did he just kind of put the bug in your ear a little bit?
Just put the bug in my ear. I did ask him how to get started, but he was basically saying, look, I only do this very part-time. I don't know how to get cases. I just know someone who sends me cases. So my process was very self-directed. I looked into all the different ways that someone could get into the expert witness field, created listings for myself on the various directories, contacted agencies, and my first case ended up coming through an intermediary.
Let's talk about that first case, or those first cases. What's it like getting that call kind of out of the blue? How do you vet each other? How do you handle that? And how has that changed over the last couple of years? How have you improved your process?
Initially, I didn't know what to ask. I initially just focused on highlighting aspects of my career that would be relevant to the case. And that's definitely the right thing to do. And it's a very essential part of the interview process. But initially, that's where I stopped. And over the years, I have added a long list of questions that I think someone who signs on to a case should really know. I think it's important to verify that the case is actually about what you believe it is about. Sometimes, although this is not a frequent issue, sometimes the case is in fact different than what you might think it is. So the most illustrative example was perhaps when somebody contacted me about testifying in a case in the area of contributory copyright infringement, which, it's a mouthful, and I didn't even know what that was, and I didn't know how they came to the conclusion that I would be an expert at that. But it turned out that the case was litigated in terms of networking technology, and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is actually written in those terms. And it did turn out that I was actually the right expert in that case. Another example that comes to mind is when they retained me as a machine learning expert, and I definitely am a machine learning expert, and the case turned out to be more about CPU architecture. So it just so happens that I know CPU architecture quite well, but I think it's very important to kind of verify at a level deeper what the case might actually be about. The second thing that comes to mind is the status of the case. Has it been filed? Has the case progressed? What the case schedule is. So sometimes what I run into is attorneys wanting a report within 2 weeks because they didn't realize they needed an expert until the expert report is coming up due, and it's almost impossible to comply with those requests unless my calendar happens to be completely open, which is rare. Another question is about support staff. Sometimes I need my own support staff for a larger case to involve researchers or source code review experts. And sometimes the attorneys themselves have junior staff who are staffed on the case to help me out researching things. So those things are good to know when planning your bandwidth, right? I think another important thing that plays into how the case is going to work out is the attorney's background. Often when I work on cases, the attorneys have the subject matter expertise, right? So maybe a patent litigation expert who works in litigating computer science patents would have at least a bachelor's in computer science. But sometimes they come from a physics background, and other times they come from a completely different background. And so the amount of education that kind of goes into working with the attorneys will definitely differ based on the attorney's background.
I'd like to dig into that a little bit for a minute. That's really interesting about educating attorneys. Tell me a little bit more about, say you have an attorney who's not a subject matter expert. To what extent do you have to kind of teach them?
I think the level differs quite a bit. I mean, even if the attorney comes from a computer science background, they may not know machine learning or the very specific technique that the patent is about. But if the attorney is coming from, let's say, an oil and gas background, then the level of education is going to be a lot different. So, do you need to teach them computer science from scratch? Do you need to tell them what source code is? Do you need to tell them what a database is, what a database table is? Or there is at least some amount of common understanding of at least the basic field that you're working in, and you really get to start at sort of a higher level and then just talk about the specifics of the case. I think there can be quite a bit of range in expertise coming from the attorneys.
The attorneys typically already know what they don't know, as it were. Do they prompt you with questions like, hey, I need to know what source code is, or I need to know what a lookup table is? Or
yeah, I think when I started out, I assumed that the attorneys knew everything, and perhaps even more than I did, because they spent a lot of time with the case. As a new expert witness, you don't have the context of knowing what other people know. And that is something that you gain over time. And I tended to speak to attorneys as if I spoke to my own professor colleagues. And over time, that became clear that it was not the right way to go about it. The issue is that many attorneys, or just people in general, have a hard time asking questions or saying, I don't know what you're talking about. They might take notes and try to look it up later. And when you're speaking for a while on advanced concepts and you're not getting any questions, that's when you might want to think about making sure that what you're saying is really landing. because in one example, the attorney asked me what I thought the case was about, and I started speaking at the level of the patent, which is highly technical. And after a half an hour, he asked a very basic question, and I thought, oh my God, for the last half hour, everything I said went straight above his head. And so I had to set up a session where for between 2 or 3 hours, I don't remember exactly, but it was a long period of time. I was going through basics of computer science, of what was needed for a basic understanding. And so it was a quick session for him to come up to speed just on what computer science is.
Wow, that must also impact your report writing. You're writing things that ostensibly can be very technical, and I imagine that you're writing for a lay audience some of the time, or you don't know if your report is going to be seen by a lay audience. So, what's your report writing process?
Yeah, I think the audience is discussed ahead of the time, or it should be if it's not brought up by the attorneys. I think you need to know if you're submitting a report that's read by a judge that has the right amount of background, or if it's going in front of a jury, or if it's going in front of the PTAB, which is the patent review board. Those people at the patent review board are really technical, and they do have the right background. So typically you want to assume that whoever is reading has a low amount of understanding, just to be on the safe side. So I think it's better to assume that you're explaining it to your grandma, and then building up sophistication as you go along in your report, than not do that, because basically you're just adding more words that increases understanding. I think that's just a best practice to follow.
Do you have any, specific organizational routine that you use when you're developing reports? In other words, do you index things? How do you go about the kind of the mechanical structure?
The mechanical structure, I think, is pretty uniform. At least the way I do it is, at the beginning, I put all the preamble logistics. I've been retained by who and how much they're paying me, and what cases I worked on previously, and no conflicts of interest, previous depositions. And then the second section is more about how I understand the case, sort of a case background. And then I go into methodology, if that's applicable. In certain types of lawsuits, it's really important to establish the methodology that you use to come to your opinions. And then finally, you get into your opinions.
Sure. Have you worked both on the plaintiff and defendant side?
I have.
Do you have a different strategy for rebuttals and rebuttal reports? Often when you're when you're working on the defense side, your report is a rebuttal report. And some people take kind of different approaches to that. I've heard from certain experts that it can be a bit easier because a lot of the foundation's already laid down, and you just have to kind of pick it apart point by point. But do you have any specific strategies?
I would say I would agree. When you write a rebuttal report, you are reading the opposing expert's opinion, and you see what you agree with and what you disagree with, and you focus on the differences of opinion and try to be as eloquent as you can be in highlighting why your opinion is the right one, or the valid one. And so it ends up being a much shorter report, meaning the rebuttal report, than an opening report.
Experts can be contacted kind of, this brings me back to one of the questions that you're telling me is useful for experts to be asking their engaging attorney regarding where are we in the case, and experts can be brought in at any time, as you indicated. Do you feel as though you typically have sufficient time to be ready for depositions or the jury or for report writing, or do you feel rushed occasionally?
I feel rushed occasionally, but typically there is enough time. It really just comes down to the fact that if I don't feel I have enough time, I don't take the case. I have had to refuse a couple of cases where it was within a week or two, and there was no way for me to come up to speed and write a report in that time frame. Some attorneys are really forward-looking, and I have been retained even before litigation. I have been retained with over a year of remaining before the initial report was due. And it is also the case that when you're running a little bit behind, you can ask for an extension. And in a couple of cases, we were able to receive an extension. I think in one case it was maybe just a few days from like being due on a Monday. It became due on Friday. In another case, the delay was 2 weeks. In another case, the opposing side was asking for an extension. So there, those types of flexibilities sometimes exist, but when the case is very acrimonious, sometimes the opposing side just, doesn't want to go into any kind of extension, and they want you to have that pressure of delivering on time and pulling all-nighters and maybe forcing you to make a mistake by doing that.
Speaking of an acrimonious opposition, do you find yourself getting impeached by the other side that you have to kind of defend your expertise? And what's that like?
I think I have in most cases the expertise itself has not been challenged as much as the relevance of my expertise to the case,
right,
or the opinion itself, or a methodology. I think that's where computer science experts spend or attorneys spend most of their time. I understand that in the medical field it might be different. I actually initially, when I got into this field, I watched a medical expert giving trial testimony, and I think 2 hours of the testimony was about his resume, and then he was asked whether the procedure was performed according to standards, and he said yes, no, and that was the substance of his testimony. But in computer science, or at least on the cases that I worked on, I think that my background gets explored only sort of minimally and to the extent that it's relevant to the case, and then they really want to get into the opinions.
So if somebody is attacking your opinion, what are your strategies to kind of alleviate that? Or is that normally left mainly to the attorney? Do you not have to deal with that so much?
No, I mean, of course, in deposition and in rebuttal testimony, that's the job of the opposing side to propose in your opinions and theories. And so I think the way that I go about it is to try to get my opinions be as little of an opinion as possible and make them as factual as possible. And anything that I say, and most things that I say, I cite references for. I think one extreme example was in one of my earlier cases where I was able to cite almost everything that I was saying from the opposing side's website. And
Wow.
and the opposing attorney in deposition at one point, I said, he said, hey, how do you know this? And I said, as I cited in my report, this information comes from your client's website. And he said, really? So literally, I think 95% of the citations were from the opponent's website. So it's very difficult to disagree with that. But even when that's not the case, and most of the time that's not the case, you still want to have third parties and third party citations, and not relying on other people's opinion, of course, but relying on data, right? So a lot of the time you can establish factual sort of opinions based on data that has been established in the literature.
What does your preparation look like? Have you done, for example, mock cross-examinations, or how do you get ready for a deposition or for a trial?
Yeah, so I think the right way to do it is to set aside at least a day with the attorneys and go through really all of your opinions and all of the variations of what the opposing side might bring to the table and how the opposing side views the case. Sometimes the different sides are not sort of head on, right? It's not
Sure.
about, well, we think it's this and you think it's that, and no, it's this, no, it's that. Usually there's usually some kind of a sidestepping going on, and one side might say, well, what you're saying is completely irrelevant because that's not what the case is about, and they might even try to exclude your opinion because it's not relevant to the case that they are trying to make, but of course it is relevant to what your client is trying to make. So you need to be aware of these context switches, right? So when the opposing side is trying to change the subject or is changing the subject because they are the ones in deposition who are asking you questions, then you need to be aware whether the question is about one of your opinions, or are they trying to steer you to say something that's good for their case? And by being aware of the context switch, you can sometimes say, well, I haven't thought of that because I wasn't asked to give an opinion on that, and I'm here to answer questions about my report, and that topic is not in my report. And if you're not on your toes, you could get into a conversation where you think it's a conversation, and as a problem solver and an intellectually curious person, you might actually start problem solving and giving opinions on the spot. And so, I think those are the things to really avoid.
Do you have a story or two about being an expert witness, or a case or two that really informed the way that you approach generally expert witnessing? Because you're not new, but a newer expert witness. And this is the point at which people tend to be developing their techniques and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So, have you had a case that fundamentally changed your approach?
I don't know that my approach changed fundamentally by any of the cases that I've done, but I think you do pick up nuggets here and there, and that definitely makes you more grounded and kind of filling in the long tail of your knowledge. And I think if you're asking for a specific case,
If you have one.
Yeah. I mean, this is not really about the case, but I think it's really instructive um, to potentially new expert witnesses. So what happened in a case was that we were retained by an attorney, and so the client was the law firm. And so, as you or may not know, your client could be a corporation or an individual who is retaining you and who is retaining the attorneys, or your client could be a law firm. And so the law firm could be then turning around and sending your invoice to their client, or the law firm could be acting as a sort of a litigation finance firm, and they just sort of litigate the case on contingency. So there are all sorts of setups, and so we got engaged by a law firm as the client, but there was another law firm who was actually doing the litigation. And we were speaking to I should say I was speaking to the attorneys who were litigating the case, and then one particular attorney from the firm that retained us. And it did not occur to me until I learned in my deposition that the law firm that retained us was not actually on the case, which means that anything that I discussed with them was not privileged, even though they
Right.
were attorneys, right? And so that's like an honest mistake. And nobody told me who was on the case, who was not on the case. You're working as an expert witness and you're talking to attorneys. You're assuming that the attorneys are on the case. But turned out that
Naturally.
one law firm was simply acting as a client. But it's, you do this long enough, these weird situations will happen.
No, that's a really interesting story. But moving on from there, what more generally makes a great relationship between you and the attorney? What makes you a good team? What are the aspects of an engagement, both on your side and the attorney's side, that help you work together and make an effective team?
So, in my experience, uh, what makes a good relationship is similar background. So, if the attorneys have a computer science background and they are litigating the same types of cases that we're working on together, that makes it a lot smoother than if they don't have that background, or they are usually working on like oil and gas licenses, and they are all of a sudden coming in and litigating a computer science patent infringement case. The timelines might be different. It's difficult to have a shared understanding, and there are just a lot more opportunities for misalignment, misunderstanding, misaligned expectations. So I place a lot of emphasis now on the attorneys I work with. And also, I don't know if this is the experience of others, but larger law firms just happen to be better to work with. But maybe that's because they have specialized teams for everything, whereas smaller law firms just see a more of a breadth of cases, and they find themselves out of their element more often. I think, large, well-established firms are just a lot easier to work with.
Before we wrap up, do you have any last tips, especially for newer expert witnesses or attorneys who are working with newer expert witnesses?
I mean, one thing that comes to mind is contract terms. As I'm going through my experiences with different clients, I'm considering adding more terms. And I recently spoke to a very experienced expert witness who pulled up on the screen his retention agreement, I think he's been an expert for 20 years now. And he asks for a retainer before he starts working on the case, before deposition, before trial. He must have had a few clients who failed to pay him.
Sure.
Fortunately, that has not happened to me. But and asking for retainers does increase friction. Um, some clients say, well, we really like you, and that we would prefer to not have a retainer. And I have so far gone down that path. But, it makes you think when you see someone so experienced having very specific payment terms like that. And, just to think that maybe he had some bad experiences along the way.
Sure, absolutely. Dr. Jonyer, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And thank you to our audience for joining me for another discussion at the Roundtable. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Discussions at Roundtable. Our show notes are available on our website, roundtablegroup.com. Subscribe today on Apple Podcasts or your favorite listening apps.